The first thing you notice is how quiet this lost kingdom sounds. No cartwheels on the ridgeways, no hooves on frozen roads. Out here in the Somerset marshes, the only noises are water sliding through black channels, wind in the reeds, and the clink of armour when someone misjudges their step and sinks ankle deep into mud. On a low rise on slightly firmer ground, men are throwing up a rough bank and timber palisade. Smoke from green wood hangs under a grey sky, and there is a small altar under a makeshift shelter with a few horses and piles of bushweed dragged in from the flooded ground. It looks far more like a bandit camp than a royal centre. This is Æthelingaīeg, and the man directing the work, tired, splattered with mud, but still giving orders, is Alfred, King of Wessex. By the spring of 878, this is what his kingdom has been reduced to. The chronicle, usually content with dates and names, suddenly sounds shaken. And in the same winter, the said King Alfred, with a small band, lived in difficulties in the woods and in the fen fastnesses of Somerset. The fen fastness is a wet island, reachable only by narrow tracks over mud and water. On three sides, the land dissolves into reed beds and black pools. On the fourth, there is just enough firm ground to cut a ditch, raise a bank, and make a fort that raiding parties can't slip past. The court of Wessex has been cut down to a few bare essentials. A scattering of thanes and housecarls, a priest with a travelling altar, and whatever families and servants escaped when Guthrum's army seized Alfred's winter hall at Chippenham. There is no great hall here, no carved pillars or long tables, just damp cloaks, a smoky fire, and men taking turns on the rampart. From the outside, this looks like a total collapse. Only weeks earlier, Guthrum and his warband had sworn peace, taken oaths, and given gifts. Then, in the first days after Christmas, they rode hard to Chippenham, stormed Alfred's royal estate, and many of the people they reduced, except for the king, to obey them. Some West Saxons submitted, some fled overseas. Others simply went home and tried to keep their heads down. Alfred would not go abroad. Instead, he would let the landscape swallow him. At Æthelingaīeg, he is not leading great field armies. He is living rough and raiding when he can, sending messages out through levies, over hill country, to find who is still willing to answer his call. It gives a strange picture of a king. The last English king in the south, technically still ruler of Wessex, but for the moment an armed fugitive in his own country. To understand how this Rome-travelled younger son ends up hiding in a swamp, and how he fights his way back out again to Æthandūn, to the Danelaw, and to the alliance with Mercia, we need to rewind to the year the Danes first came for Wessex, and the battles that will make him king. Welcome to the story of England, where we're telling the full story of England, from the first shadowy arrivals in these lands, through the rise of kings and kingdoms, all the way to the moment England stops just looking inwards and starts turning its gaze to the seas. In this series, we're not just looking at names and dates, we're following real people making dangerous decisions in a violent, changing world. Last time, we watched the great heathen army rip through 3 kingdoms, tearing Northumbria in half, humiliating Mercia, and killing Edmund of East Anglia so brutally that his people had to remake him as a saint just to live with it. By the end of that episode, there was only one serious English kingdom left standing. In this episode, we will stay with that kingdom, and with the man who will be asked to carry it, Alfred. We will watch him step up from younger brother to king in one of the bloodiest years in West Saxon history. We will see him driven into the marshes we've just visited, and then follow him back out again to a battlefield at Æthandūn. We'll see how that victory hardens into the Danelaw, how his alliance with a battered Mercia and his systems of new burhs and ships turn Wessex from victim into something like a fortress. By the time Alfred dies, the Danes will still hold half the country, but for the first time, the English south of that line have done more than just hang on. They have started to build something that can push back. When the Great Army first comes into Wessex, Alfred is not king, he is the spare. In his early 20s, the youngest son of King Æthelwulf, he has spent most of his adult life as his elder brother's right hand, fighting, advising, and watching. Wessex has seen the Viking raids before. There have even been big fleet actions off the south coast. But in the winter of 870-871, what arrives on its eastern border is the same coalition that has already broken Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. They will cross from Mercia into Berkshire and seize Reading, throw up a defensive ditch and bank around the old royal Ville, and begin using it as the base on the Kennet and the Thames. From there, they can probe south into Wessex and north back towards Mercia, all the while living off the surrounding countryside. The first clash is almost accidental. A force will come out of the Reading camp to raid and scout, but at Englefield, just west of Reading, it will run into a local West Saxon levy under the ealdorman Æthelwulf. The chronicle will tell us that the Christians had the victory and that many of the Danes were killed. This is a sharp little success, but it will not change the fact that the main army is still sitting in its fortified base. 4 days later, Ethelred and Alfred will bring up the full West Saxon host and attack Reading. Initially things will go well. They will catch the Danes outside the ramparts, kill them in large numbers, and push them back towards the gates. But then the garrison will burst out in a mass counterattack. And in the crush at the earthworks, the advantage begins to swing the Vikings' way. The West Saxon line will buckle and will have to retreat. Æthelwulf, the victor at Englefield, will be left dead on the field. Reading is a clear defeat, but Wessex has no choice but to keep the field and hope to regain the initiative. A few days later, they will meet the Great Army again, this time on the open upland. The battle that later tradition will call Aesc's Hill. The sources will differ on the exact spot, but they will agree on the shape of the fight. The Danes will take the high ground and divide their army in two, a main division around their standard and a second under chosen leaders. Ethelred and Alfred will mirror this, each taking one half of the West Saxon force. Their plan is to hit both half of the Danish line at once. On the morning of the battle, though, a problem appears. Ethelred is still in his tent, hearing mass, and insists on finishing the service. Meanwhile, the Danes are on the move. With one enemy division already coming down off the ridge, Alfred has no choice. He must take action now. He will order his men to lock shields and drive them uphill into the oncoming Danes, taking the fight onto the ridge before the enemy has a chance to fully form. It is a brutal slog, and at some point Ethelred will join with the main body of the army. The battle will sway back and forth along the crest, later remembered as being marked by a single thorn tree. By the end of the day, the Danes will break. Several of their leaders are dead, and the rest of the army will flee back towards Reading. Exile is now the only clear West Saxon victory in what the Chronicle will simply call that year of battles. It proves that the great army can be beaten in the field, and it will mark Alfred out as someone willing to act decisively under pressure. Unfortunately, though, it will not make the Danes go away. Two more battles will follow in quick succession, Basing and Meretun. At Basing, the armies will meet again, and after heavy losses on both sides, the pagans will hold the field. And at Meretun, probably somewhere in North Hampshire, the Chronicle says there is great slaughter on either hand. But once more, the English will end up being driven off. These men, who had gone home talking proudly of the Battle of Exile, now find themselves trudging west through the rain and leaving their friends in the mud. In the middle of this grind, another blow will fall. Sometime in the early months of 871, Ethelred will die. The sources are quiet on the details, perhaps illness, perhaps wounds, but they all agree that he will disappear from the record and that Alfred will succeed him. There will be no peaceful succession. When Alfred becomes king, he is in the middle of a life or death campaign. He will barely have time to be crowned, and afterwards he will have to lead a smaller West Saxon force against the whole Danish army at Wilton on the River Wyle. Outnumbered and exhausted, his men will fight well enough to first drive the Danes back, but then they will overextend themselves, are then counterattacked and eventually forced to retreat. At the end of the day, the Danes will remain in possession of the field. Later writers will say that Alfred fought with few and unequal forces at Wilton, and that the narrowness of this fight convinced the great army that it had had enough of the battering against Wessex for the moment. Either way, what follows is not triumph, but a deal. Alfred will make peace, and that almost certainly means silver, oaths, and hostages, along with the bitter knowledge that, so far, oaths have not stopped this army changing its mind when it sees an advantage. By the end of 871, Wessex has fought at least 6 major actions: Englefield, Reading, Exile, Basing, Meretun, and Wilton. It has won 2 and lost 4. Its old king is dead, and the new one has already learned what it means to take the field with fewer men than he needs. For a few years, the Great Army will turn its main attention back to Mercia and Northumbria, giving Alfred the breathing room he needs to patch together his battered kingdom. But the men he has been fighting decide that they are not done with him yet. In 878, Guthrum will come for him in midwinter, and that is how the King of Wessex will end up on a wet island in the Somerset levels, with only a handful of followers and a question: is there anything left worth trying to save? The chronicle's single line about Alfred at Æthelingaīeg, with a small band in difficulties, leaves a lot unsaid. Æthelingaīeg is not a random hiding place. It is a good base for exactly three things: surviving, raiding, and sending messages. From his island fort, Alfred will begin to probe. Small bands will ride out to hit Viking outposts or unguarded foraging parties, and then vanish back into the marsh. More importantly though, his messages will slip out into hill country to the north and east, quietly asking a question: who still remembers their oaths? Who is willing to risk another round? The answer will take its time to come, but it will come. Around Easter, Alfred will strengthen Æthelingaīeg, building it up into a proper burh, a fortified base rather than just a camp. Shortly afterwards, he will ride to Egbert's Stone in the east part of Selwood, and there he'll be met by men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and the surviving core of Hampshire who haven't fled overseas. For the first time since Chippenham, he has something that looks like an army. From Egbert's Stone, they will move on to Æthandūn, a ridge in northwest Wiltshire. Guthrum's main army will be there, somewhere between the chalk uplands and the Avon. This is the moment everything has been moving towards. If Alfred loses, there won't be a second chance. The sources give us only outlines, but they all agree on the essentials. Alfred will draw up his men in a shield wall and advance. The Danes will do the same, with the two lines crashing together, and they stand locked for most of the day. Eventually, the English will push through, and the chronicle talks of fierce fighting, and of Alfred gaining a full victory over the Danes, who were driven back into a fortress, probably at Chippenham or nearby. For 2 weeks, Alfred and his men will sit outside the Danish stronghold, cutting off their food and water supply. Inside, Guthrum's army, the same coalition that once wintered comfortably in royal halls, begins to starve. At last, they will ask for terms. Those terms are significant. On one level, they look like earlier deals: oaths, hostages, and promises. But this time, Alfred will add something new. Guthrum and a third of his chief men agree to be baptized. Alfred will stand in as Guthrum's godfather, renaming him Æthelstan and spreading rich gifts. This is a public, performative Christianization of the main Danish leader. Part piety, part politics, and part a statement that the gods have failed him. Alongside the baptism comes a treaty, setting out the boundary between Alfred's territory and Guthrum's. It will run through East Anglia and across Mercia. In the south and west, there will be Alfred's Wessex and what is left of English Mercia. To the north and east, the lands where Danish law and custom will prevail, and what later generations will call the Danelaw. From one angle, this looks like a concession. Half the country is in effect written off as Viking or Viking ruled. But from another, it is a survival strategy of a genius. Alfred, the king who was trapped in a swamp with a small band of men, has turned into the man who can dictate a line on the map and have his enemy accept it. For the first time, there is a formal recognition that there are two different zones of England, and that Alfred has a recognised right to rule one of them. The men who trudged home from the Æthandūn campaign can see that difference. A few months earlier, they were fugitives or forced subjects. Now they have seen that great army beaten, and their own king stand as godfather to its leader. The question is, what will they do with that breathing space? Now feels like a good time to look to the land just to the north of Wessex, where this old English powerhouse of Mercia is looking very different. Once dominated by the Midland kings like Offa, this land has been torn apart and taken by storm. Burh, who we left negotiating with the Vikings at Nottingham, has been driven into exile in Rome. And a man called Ceolwulf holds a cut-down version of the crown under heavy Danish influence. The eastern half of the old Mercian kingdom is effectively in Viking hands. Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln and Stamford will later be remembered as the 5 burhs of the Danelaw, fortified Danish towns in what had once been core Mercian territory. In the rump of western Mercia, a different story is beginning. A noble called Æthelred will emerge as a leader, and at some point in the 880s, he will marry Alfred's daughter, Æthelflæd. That marriage will symbolise a new arrangement. Mercia is no longer an equal partner in the old heptarchy. It is an allied, semi-subordinate kingdom, lorded over by Alfred, but still with its own strong identity, institutions and armies. The most visible sign of this new Wessex-Mercian axis comes in 886. King Alfred will occupy London, a city that has been fought over and lightly garrisoned by the Danes already. Now, when Alfred retakes it, he will repair its Roman walls and streets, and plans to rebuild it as a fortified burh. Crucially though, he won't hand it over to a West Saxon ealdorman, but to Æthelred of Mercia. On the political map, that move will do several jobs at once. It will give Alfred a major trading and military base on the Thames, close to the Danelaw frontier, to keep an eye on potential threats. Alfred will tie London into the Wessex-Mercian alliance, rather than letting it drift off as a semi-independent prize. These are some of the first signals that Alfred is now thinking of himself, or being thought of, as more than just King of Wessex. Sources will now begin to call him the King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that will include English Mercia as well. For people living along this new frontier, life would not suddenly become peaceful. Raiding and counter-raiding continue along the line between Alfred's law and the Danelaw. Towns like London and the future 5 burhs are both trading partners and potential enemies. But now there is a rough framework. There are kings on both sides who most years know where the other one's rip begins and ends. South of that line, Alfred uses the 880s to do something no English king has tried to do on this scale before. You cannot fight an enemy like the Great Heathen Army just by turning up with a big host whenever they appear. Alfred has seen what this looks like in 871, and he doesn't like it. His answer, in the years after Æthandūn, is to change how his kingdom works. Across Wessex and English Mercia, he will start to weave a net of fortified places, burhs all over the landscape. Some of these are old Roman towns like Winchester, Exeter and London, given repaired walls and planned street grids. Others are newer sites on river crossings and hill spurs. In a document known as the Burh, each one has its wall length measured and a fixed number of hides tied to it, so that each yard of the rampart is supposed to have the right number of men in any time of danger. At the same time, Alfred will reorganise the fyrd. Instead of dragging the whole levy into the field and then sending everyone home, he will begin to rotate service. He will have one part of the free population on campaign, a second part at home, farming, and a third manning the burhs. They will all take it in turns and swap places. The fyrd is still a fairly blunt instrument, but now it means Wessex can keep an army in the field just that little bit longer. He will also experiment with ships. Later sources will say that he ordered vessels bigger and higher sided than the average longship. Finally, Wessex had a home navy to use against raiders on their south coast. Taken together, the burhs, a rotating fyrd, and ships, you can see him trying to build a system rather than trust chance to single heroic battles. His new system will be tested hard in 892. After decades of raiding in Francia, the lower Seine and other Frankish rivers have become a less friendly environment. The Franks have thrown up forts at bridgeheads and on river bends. Easy plunder is getting harder and harder to come by. These raiders will start to look across the channel and see something that from a distance still looks tempting. A rich island with familiar rivers and a kingdom that is only just staggered back from crisis. They will come in two main bodies, with one army of roughly 250 ships. Will sail straight into the Limp estuary in Kent, and then move up and occupy the unfinished earthwork at Door. The Anglo-Saxon sources won't name individual leaders here. They will simply call it the army at Appledore. But it is probably a coalition of the bands that we have seen active on the Seine and the Loire. The second invasion, smaller but still serious, will come with only around 80 ships and sail up the Thames and into the Swale. It will fortify at Milton Regis in North Kent. This group has a named commander, Hastein. Frankish sources know him as a seasoned raider, active on the Loire in the 860s and 870s. He is associated with some of the more spectacular stunts of this age. Now he has turned up in England. Alfred responds with something that would have been impossible 20 years earlier. He will move his main field army into a position between Appledore and Milton, somewhere in the belt of land between the Thames and the Wold, so that he can move against whichever host breaks out first. At the same time, he will reach for the diplomatic answer. With Hastein, Alfred will cut a deal. He will send him money and gifts, and Hastein's 2 sons are baptised. Alfred and Ethelred of Mercia will stand as their godfathers. On parchment, this brings Hastein into a web of Christian obligation and personal ties. In practice, it has brought a pause in fighting and maybe a temporary refocusing of his attention away from Wessex. Hastein, though, is not a man who will let other people's paperwork dictate his future for long. First major move will come from the Appledore host. With Alfred watching Hastein, the Appledore army breaks out and heads west. They will raid into Kent, Hampshire and Berkshire, hauling off plunder and captives in vast numbers. But before they can reach ships or a safe fortified base, they are intercepted at Farnham by a West Saxon force under Alfred's eldest son, Edward. Edward will put this army to flight and retake its plunder, and then he will chase them onto an island in the Colne River. The chronicle is brief about what happens next, and it will simply say that Edward put them to flight and took the plunder. He will then drive them onto an island in the River Colne, showing us that at this point in time, Alfred no longer has to be everywhere at once. His eldest son can take a field army out on his own and stand in the way of a Viking column before it can reach safety. Edward will turn what looked like another dangerous campaign into a messy, scrambling retreat. But while Edward is dealing with Appledore's men, other Vikings move in to stretch the system. Fleets from Northumbria and East Anglia sail round the southwest and besiege Exeter. That threat is serious enough that Alfred turns west with a major part of his field force to relieve the city. Because Exeter is a burh, its garrison will hold firm, and the city will not fall. The Viking force will eventually slip away by sea, but with Alfred tied down in Devon, the line against Hastein in the east is thinner than before. Hastein won't be able to pass up this opportunity. Leaving Milton, he will shift his main camp across the Thames estuary to a new fort at Beanfleet, just on the Essex shore. It is a great spot, a tidal creek for his ships, higher ground for a fort, and easy routes inland into Essex and up towards the Midlands. He will move his ships, treasure and family there. From Beanfleet, Hastein will raid deep into Mercia. At some point in 893 though, Hastein and much of his field force is out on one of these inland expeditions, and news will reach London that the fort at Beanfleet is thinly held. Alfred had already detached a substantial contingent eastward when he marched for Exeter. These men will join the London garrison and the other local levies. The chronicle will simply call them the Army from London and also the towns nearest to it. But many historians see Ethelred of Mercia and the local West Saxon ealdormen as the likely commanders on the ground. They will march on Beanfleet and their attack will be decisive. The combined force will storm the stronghold, drive out or kill the defenders, and destroy all the captured ships. Hastein's carefully prepared base is overrun, and many of his ships are burnt and seized. his accumulated plunder goes into English hands, and his wife and sons, the same three that Alfred and Æthelred had sponsored, are captured. Beanfleet is not a neat, set-piece shield-walled moment like Æthandūn, but as an example of Alfred's system doing to a Viking camp what a Viking camp used to do to English towns. Alfred himself is days away, locked up with the problem in Exeter. Yet the Burh at London and the forces around it can mass, strike, and then melt back into their fortified network. For Hastein, this is a public failure. For Alfred and his allies, it is proof that the landscape now pushes back. Hastein will negotiate to get his family back, and Alfred and Æthelred will eventually return his wife and sons, on the condition that the boys are baptised and Hastein swears again to leave Wessex alone. Once more, his promises won't hold for long. With what is left of his following, as well as being joined by other bands from Northumbria and East Anglia, he will push inland into the Severn Valley. There, a Viking army will wind up fortifying an island in the Severn near Buttington, in what is now Powys. It is a familiar tactic. Pick a defensive spot with water on most sides, build a rampart, and live off raids. This time, when the call goes out for help, the response will look very different from 871. A combined force of West Saxons, Mercians, and Welsh converge on Buttington and besiege it. The Danes will hold out until the moment they have to begin eating their horses. When they finally attempt to break out, they are met with a hard counterattack. Many will be killed, and the survivors will be driven off in greatly reduced numbers, and they will be harried all the way as they stagger back east. After Buttington, there are still bands of Vikings on the loose, and one major group associated with Hastein will move north and capture the old Roman city of Chester. A frontal assault on those thick stone walls would be costly, so instead, Alfred and his allies will use the land. They will burn or carry off the surrounding crops and livestock, making it impossible for the Vikings to feed themselves. Without food, the garrison can't sit tight, and eventually they will be forced to move on in smaller, more desperate groups. It is another example of the shift from heroic set-piece fights to a more attritional, strategic way of war. Meanwhile, further southeast, there is one more classic engineering moment. After Beanfleet, and after various marches across the Midlands, a Viking force will work its way up the Thames and then into the Lee. There, it will throw up a fortified camp somewhere northeast of London. This position will allow them to threaten both London and the surrounding shires while having their ships close at hand. Alfred will bring up his field army and confront them. A direct assault on the camp over the river would be ugly. So instead of assaulting, Alfred will order his men to dig channels and divert the Lee, lowering the level so that the Viking ships were left stranded. Once their escape route is compromised, the Danes will abandon their base and drag their ships off overland. Local garrisons and field forces will harry them as they go. This is not a dramatic single-day victory, but taken with Exeter, Beanfleet, Buttington and Chester, it reinforces the picture. In the last years of Alfred's reign, wars are not just about one big battle. They are about a web of forts, marches, sieges and engineering advantages slowly grinding down a host that has arrived with families and ambitions and is now being forced to either settle under Alfred's terms or leave. By 896, the chronicle can afford to be almost casual. Then the great army went, some to East Anglia, some to Northumbria, and those who were moneyless obtained ships and went to the Seine. In other words, what began a serious attempt to renew the Great Assault on England has ended in dispersal. Some groups will disappear into the existing Danelaw, while others slink back to the continent. The Danelaw itself is still there. York, the 5 boroughs, and a Danish East Anglia still remain Scandinavian or under Scandinavian-backed rulers. But for the second time in his reign, Alfred has faced a major coalition and stopped it breaking Wessex and English Mercia. The difference from 871 is that this time he has done it not just with courage in a shield wall, but with a structure that can keep working even when he is not personally in the field. War is not the only thing Alfred will spend his reign on, even if it will sometimes dominate the page. After Æthandūn and his first treaty with Guthrum, he will turn and look at the society he is trying to protect. He issues a law code that weaves together the older precedents from Kent, Mercia, and the earlier West Saxon kings. Prefaced with biblical material and framed as an attempt to administer justice for all the people over whom we and God have given us authority. He complains famously about the lack of learning in his kingdom, and commissions or undertakes translations of key Latin works into Old English. Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius, and parts of Augustine. He will argue that these texts should be available to all the freeborn youth of England who were able to apply themselves to it. At his court, scribes will begin to compile the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, knitting together older annals into a continuous story that for the first time tells the history of the English people in their own language. All of this matters for the Danelaw conversation. South and west of the treaty line, Alfred is helping to create a sense of the people he rules. The West Saxons and English Mercians are alike, and they belong to a single Anglekin, an English people, with shared laws, stories, and a king who defines himself against the heathen and the foreigner. North and east of that line is the Danelaw. A different mix of customs and identities is emerging. Anglo-Scandinavian law terms, Scandinavian place names, and hybrid elites. Militarily, by the mid-890s, the immediate crisis has ended. The great host has broken up, some warbands going back to the continent, while others settling inside the Danelaw. The raiding will never really stop, and there are still ugly years on the south coast and in the Channel. But Wessex and Mercia are no longer on the brink of being wiped off the map. Alfred hasn't had an easy life, and the sources hint at a chronic illness. His reign is a busy one, and he will spend most of it negotiating, fighting, building, arguing with bishops and aldermen, and constantly trying to find men and silver to hold the line. In 899, after roughly 28 years as king, Alfred dies. He is probably in his early 50s, and the chronicle will mark his passing with a brief note as it moves on to his son Edward, just as briskly as it has always moved on from one reign to the next. But for once, we get to pause and see the before and after. When Alfred became king in 871, Wessex was reeling from defeats, its old king freshly buried, and its new one losing battles and buying peace. Mercia was still formally its equal, and Northumbria and East Anglia were collapsing under blows. There was no clear sense that anyone ruled the English as a whole. By the time he dies, though, Wessex and English Mercia are still intact. London is back in Allied hands, and a line has been drawn that acknowledges a Danish sphere, but also acknowledges Alfred's. A network of burhs and a highly organised fyrd means that a new great host cannot simply walk through the south. His law code, the Chronicle, and his translations of Latin works have started to give the people under his rule a shared legal and cultural toolkit. The Danes are still a threat, but now in the south there is a hardened core around Wessex and Mercia that his children, Edward and Æthelflaed, can use as a base to push that frontier north. In the next episode, we will follow them, Edward the Elder in the south, and Æthelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, in the Midlands. They will take Alfred's network of burhs and alliances and use them not just to survive, but to roll back the frontier. Town by town, borough by borough, until for the first time, England will be ruled as one kingdom. Thank you for listening to The Story of England. If you have enjoyed this episode and would like to hear the rest of the journey, from kings hiding in marshes to shield wall to Æthandūn, and the first glimmers of a united English crown, please follow and subscribe to the show and consider leaving a rating or a short review wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps other listeners find the series. Thank you once again. I've been Joe Evans, and this is The Story of England.